Sometimes the life we're supposed to live isn't the life our hearts are calling for. Standing in her wedding dress, Eliza was about to marry for duty, not love. Then Jedediah Cole rode into town like thunder and changed everything. He swept her onto his horse and carried her away to the mountains. What the town called kidnapping, she called freedom. They rode through wild country, shared meals by campfires, and slept under endless stars. She discovered that the man everyone feared was the only one who truly saw her. Days turned into the best of her life. But when the posse caught up, she faced an impossible choice. Would she return to safety or stay with the man who had stolen her heart? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Red Bluff's main street, painting the dusty ground with patches of gold and amber. Church bells chimed their cheerful rhythm, calling the entire territory to witness what folks were already calling the wedding of the century. From her bedroom window in the grand Victorian house that overlooked the town, Eliza Thornton could see the steady stream of carriages and riders making their way toward the white-steepled church where her fate awaited. She turned from the window, her fingers trailing along the cool glass, and caught her reflection in the ornate mirror that had belonged to her grandmother. The woman staring back wore the finest wedding dress money could buy, imported French lace, seed pearls that caught the morning light, and a train that would require 3 young girls to carry it down the aisle. Yet the eyes looking back at her held no joy. Only a quiet resignation that had settled there months ago when the engagement was announced. "Miss Eliza, you look like an angel descended from heaven itself." Martha, her devoted maid who had cared for her since childhood, bustled into the room, carrying a small wooden jewelry box. "Your father said to give you this for something old." She opened the box to reveal a strand of pearls that had graced the necks of Thornton women for 3 generations. Eliza lifted the pearls, feeling their familiar weight. As Martha fastened the clasp, something crinkled beneath the velvet lining of the box, a pressed wildflower, purple and delicate, now brittle with age. Her breath caught. She remembered the day she had placed it there, 7 years ago, when the world had seemed full of endless possibilities, and her heart had belonged to someone else entirely. "Thank you, Martha." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Has Father spoken with Reverend Mackenzie about the ceremony?" "Oh yes, child. Everything's arranged, just as proper as can be. Your father's downstairs greeting the guests, proud as a peacock. And Mr. Whitmore," Martha's voice took on that tone of forced cheerfulness that had become all too familiar. "He's waiting at the church with his family. Such a fine figure of a man, and wealthy too. You'll want for nothing." Nothing except love, Eliza thought, but she simply nodded and smoothed the silk of her skirt. Samuel Whitmore was indeed everything a father could want in a son-in-law. At 42, he owned the largest cattle ranch in 3 counties, commanded respect in business circles from Denver to San Francisco, and had enough political connections to ensure the Thornton family's continued prosperity. He was also kind enough in his distant way, never raising his voice or showing anything but polite consideration for her opinions. The problem wasn't what Samuel was, it was what he wasn't. He wasn't the man who had once made her laugh until her sides ached, who had taught her to read the signs of changing weather in the clouds, who had held her hand as they walked along the creek and spoke of dreams that seemed possible under the vast Montana sky. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Eliza?" Her father's voice carried the authority that had built his banking empire from nothing. "It's time, sweetheart." Charles Thornton filled the doorway, resplendent in his formal morning coat. At 65, he remained an imposing figure, silver-haired, broad-shouldered, with the kind of presence that commanded attention in any room. He had worked his way up from a clerk in a frontier bank to owning half the businesses in Red Bluff, and he had done it all for one purpose: to give his daughter a life of security and respectability. "You look beautiful, my dear." He crossed the room and placed his hands on her shoulders, his eyes reflecting genuine affection mixed with something else, relief. Perhaps that this long-planned arrangement was finally coming to fruition. "Your mother would have been so proud to see this day." The mention of her mother, who had died when Eliza was 15, sent a familiar pang through her chest. Margaret Thornton had been the gentle balance to her husband's driving ambition, the one person who might have understood the battle raging in her daughter's heart. But Margaret was gone, and Eliza had learned to navigate the expectations of frontier society without her mother's wisdom to guide her. "Father," she began, then stopped. What could she say? That she had spent sleepless nights wondering if security was worth sacrificing happiness. That every practical reason for this marriage felt hollow when measured against the memory of a love that had consumed her completely. That sometimes, late at night, she still found herself listening for the sound of hoofbeats that would never come. "What is it, child?" She looked into his weathered face, seeing the man who had built an empire to protect her from the hardships he had endured. He had grown up poor, the son of a failed farmer, and had sworn his daughter would never know want or uncertainty. How could she tell him that his greatest gift felt like a cage? "Nothing, father, I'm ready." But as they made their way down the grand staircase, past the oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors and the crystal chandelier that had been shipped from St. Louis, Eliza's mind drifted to another time, another place. She remembered summer evenings when she would slip away from formal dinners and social obligations to meet a young man by the creek. Jedediah Cole had been everything her father warned her against, a trapper's son with no prospects, no education, no place in polite society. But he had possessed something that all of Samuel's wealth couldn't buy, the ability to see straight into her soul. The memory came rushing back with vivid clarity. She had been 21, supposedly old enough to know better, but young enough to believe that love could conquer any obstacle. Jed had been working as a guide for her father's business associates, leading hunting parties into the high country. She had first seen him loading supplies outside the mercantile, his sun-darkened hands sure and capable as he checked knots and balanced loads. When their eyes met across the dusty street, something had passed between them that defied explanation, recognition, perhaps, of kindred spirits trapped in different worlds. Their courtship had been conducted in secret, stolen moments when duty and propriety released their hold. He would wait for her by the old oak tree at the edge of town, and they would walk together along paths known only to wildlife and Indian hunting parties. He spoke to her about the mountains as if they were living beings, described the peace that could be found in vast silences, shared stories of a world beyond the rigid confines of Red Bluff society. "You don't belong in drawing rooms and tea parties," he had told her one evening as they sat beside the creek, watching the first stars appear. "You belong in places where you can breathe free." She had known he was right, had felt it in the way her spirit soared when they were together in the wild places. But knowing and acting were different things, and the weight of family expectations had eventually proven stronger than young love. The sound of horses and carriages in the street below brought her back to the present. Through the front windows, she could see the procession of Red Bluff's finest families making their way to the church. Mrs. Henderson from the Ladies' Auxiliary waved from her carriage, her husband tipping his hat in respectful acknowledgement. The bank's board members were there, along with the merchants who depended on Thornton financing, the ranchers who trusted Charles with their business, and the politicians who valued his support. "Quite a turnout," her father observed with satisfaction. "Samuel's family brought relatives from as far as California. This union will strengthen connections all across the territory." Connections, unions, alliances. The language of business applied to matters of the heart, reducing love to a ledger entry. Eliza felt a familiar tightness in her chest, the sensation of walls closing in that had plagued her increasingly as the wedding day approached. "The carriage is ready, miss." Martha appeared with Eliza's bouquet, white roses and baby's breath, chosen for their symbolic meaning of new beginnings and everlasting love. The irony wasn't lost on her. As they stepped out into the bright morning air, the whole town seemed to pause in tribute. Children waved from storefronts, ladies nodded approvingly from beneath their parasols, and men touched their hat brims in respect. This was her moment of triumph, the culmination of everything her father had worked to achieve. She should have felt proud, grateful, eager for the future that awaited her. Instead, as the carriage rolled toward the church, she found herself scanning the horizon, searching for something she couldn't name. The mountains rose in the distance, purple and mysterious in the morning haze, holding secrets she would never learn and adventures she would never know. Somewhere up there, in the high country beyond the reach of civilization's demands, was the life she might have lived if courage had been stronger than duty. The church bells grew louder as they approached, their joyful pealing calling her toward a future that felt as inevitable as sunset. In a few minutes, she would walk down that aisle, speak the words that would bind her to Samuel Whitmore forever, and become the woman everyone expected her to be. The dutiful daughter, the suitable wife, the pillar of respectable society. But as the carriage came to a stop and her father helped her down, adjusting the train of her dress with careful precision, Eliza couldn't shake the feeling that she was about to bury something precious, some essential part of herself that would never see daylight again. The pressed wildflower in her jewelry box seemed to burn against her memory, a reminder of dreams that had withered not from lack of water, but from lack of light. The interior of Red Bluff's church had been transformed into a vision of frontier elegance. White ribbons cascaded from every pew, garlands of wildflowers framed the altar, and candles flickered in brass holders that had been polished to mirror brightness. The congregation filled every seat, ranchers in their Sunday best, town merchants with their wives dressed in imported silks, and children who had been scrubbed clean and warned to sit still during the ceremony. At the altar, Samuel Whitmore stood with the bearing of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. His dark suit was perfectly tailored, his silver-streaked hair combed with mathematical precision, and his pale blue eyes held the satisfaction of a business deal well concluded. Beside him, his best man, his brother-in-law from Sacramento, shifted nervously and checked his pocket watch for the third time in 5 minutes. Reverend Mackenzie, a thin man with kind eyes and prematurely gray hair, held his prayer book with steady hands despite the magnitude of the occasion. He had married 3 generations of Red Bluff's founding families, but never had he felt the weight of social expectation quite so heavily. This wasn't just a wedding, it was the joining of 2 dynasties, the cementing of power structures that would shape the territory for decades to come. The church doors opened with a creak that seemed to echo through the sacred space. Charles Thornton appeared first, his chest swelled with pride as he surveyed the assembled crowd. Behind him came his daughter, and a collective intake of breath rippled through the congregation. Eliza moved with the grace of a woman born to drawing rooms and finishing schools, but something in her expression, a distant quality, as if she were watching the proceedings from somewhere far away, gave pause to those who knew her well. The wedding march began, played by Mrs. Cartwright on the piano that had been donated by the Ladies' Auxiliary 5 years prior. Each note seemed to hang in the air, like a question waiting for an answer. Eliza placed her hand on her father's arm and began the long walk down the aisle, her train rustling against the worn wooden floor with each measured step. Faces turned toward her, some beaming with approval, others studying her with the clinical interest of society matrons evaluating a prized possession. Mrs. Henderson nodded approvingly from the third pew. The bank president's wife dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. Young ladies who had grown up with Eliza watched with expressions that mixed admiration and envy. But Eliza saw none of them. Her gaze was fixed on some point beyond the altar, beyond the stained glass windows, beyond the walls of the church itself. With each step, She felt herself moving further away from something essential, not toward a new life, but away from the life that might have been. Samuel's eyes met hers as she drew closer, and she saw in them the same practical satisfaction she had observed in her father's business dealings. Not unkind, but transactional. She would be a credit to his name, bear his children, manage his household, and together they would build something substantial and respectable. It was more than many women could hope for, her father had reminded her repeatedly. Security, status, and a husband who would treat her with consideration, if not passion. Dearly beloved, Reverend Mackenzie began as Charles placed Eliza's hand in Samuel's and stepped back to take his seat in the front pew. We are gathered here today in the sight of God and this company to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony. The familiar words washed over the congregation like a benediction. This was how things were done, how society perpetuated itself, how order was maintained in a world that could turn chaotic without warning. Marriage was the foundation upon which civilization was built, the sacred contract that ensured stability and continuity. Marriage is not to be entered into lightly or unadvisedly, but reverently, discreetly, and in accordance with the purposes for which it was instituted by God. Eliza's mind began to drift as the Reverend continued with the ceremonial language. Through the window to her left, she could see a slice of the mountains, their peaks still touched with snow, despite the warmth of the late spring day. Somewhere up there, eagles soared on thermals that lifted them above the concerns of earthbound creatures. Somewhere up there was a world where hearts could follow their own compass, without regard for social expectations or family obligations. If any person present knows of any lawful impediment why these two should not be joined in matrimony, let them speak now or forever hold their peace. The question hung in the air like morning mist, and for a moment that seemed to stretch toward eternity, the only sound was the whisper of wind through the open church doors. It was a formality. Of course, who would dare interrupt the wedding of the century? Who would risk the wrath of Charles Thornton and Samuel Whitmore by suggesting that this union should not proceed? The silence was broken by a sound that seemed to come from the earth itself, the thunder of hoofbeats approaching at a gallop. At first, it was distant enough to ignore, perhaps just a late arrival rushing to witness the ceremony. But the sound grew louder, more urgent, until it seemed to shake the very foundations of the church. Heads began to turn toward the doors. Children pressed their faces to windows. The horses outside grew restless, their whinnying adding to the sense of impending disruption. Reverend Mackenzie paused in his recitation, his eyebrows drawing together in concern. Then the church doors burst open with a force that sent them crashing against the walls. Sunlight streamed in, temporarily blinding those closest to the entrance, and through that blazing portal rode a figure that seemed conjured from legend itself. Jedediah Cole sat astride a black stallion whose coat gleamed like polished obsidian. The horse's hooves struck sparks from the stone threshold as it pranced and snorted, barely contained by its rider's firm hand. Jed himself was a vision from another world, buckskin jacket, darkened by weather and wear, broad-brimmed hat, shadowing eyes that burned with purpose, and across his saddle a silver compass that caught the light and threw it back in brilliant flashes. The congregation erupted in chaos. Women screamed, men shouted, children pointed in wonder and terror. Samuel's face went white with shock, then red with fury. Charles Thornton half rose from his seat, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. But Eliza felt something entirely different, wash over her, a sensation, like diving into a cool mountain stream on a summer day, shocking and exhilarating, and absolutely right. 7 years fell away in an instant, and she was 21 again, heart pounding with the knowledge that anything was possible. Eliza. Jed's voice cut through the tumult like a blade through silk. It was deeper than she remembered, roughened by years of wind and weather, but it spoke her name like a prayer answered. It's time to go. This is outrageous. Samuel sputtered, stepping forward as if to shield her from this wild apparition. Sheriff. Where's the sheriff? This man has no right. But Jed's attention was entirely focused on the woman in white, who stood frozen at the altar. In his weathered face, she saw the boy who had once promised to show her the world beyond Red Bluff's narrow boundaries. In his eyes, she saw 7 years of longing, 7 years of waiting, 7 years of hoping that someday the chance would come to make things right. I know what they told you about me, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the church despite the continued chaos around them. I know what they made you believe, but I kept my promise, Eliza. I came back for you. The silver compass at his saddle seemed to pulse with light, its needle pointing not toward magnetic north, but toward something far more powerful, the pull of 2 hearts that had never stopped calling to each other across the void of separation. Samuel made a grab for Eliza's arm, but she stepped away from him with fluid grace, her train swirling around her feet like spun snow. For the first time in months, her movements felt entirely her own, governed not by duty or expectation, but by choice. You can't seriously be considering this madness, her father roared from the front pew. Eliza, think of your reputation, think of your future. But she was thinking perhaps more clearly than she had in years. The pressed wildflower in her jewelry box, the dreams she had buried beneath layers of propriety, the part of herself she had nearly surrendered forever, all of it came rushing back in a torrent of recognition. Jed extended his hand toward her, and she could see in his palm the calluses earned through honest work, the scars that told stories of survival and determination. This was the hand that had once helped her across creek stones, that had pointed out constellations in the vast Montana sky, that had held hers as they made promises beneath the old oak tree. The choice is yours, he said simply. It always was. Around them, the chaos continued to build. Men were pushing toward the front of the church, their faces dark with outrage and purpose. Someone was shouting for weapons. Someone else was screaming about the sheriff. But in the eye of this social hurricane, 2 people faced each other across a chasm of years and circumstances, connected by something stronger than convention or fear. Eliza looked at Samuel, seeing in his face the comfortable predictability of the life that awaited her. Then she looked at Jed, seeing in his eyes the promise of everything uncertain and wild and real. The moment stretched between possibility and resignation, between the safe path and the true one. With movements that felt like awakening from a long dream, she reached up and pulled the pins from her wedding veil, letting the yards of imported lace flutter to the church floor like a flag of surrender. Then she placed her hand in Jed's, feeling the electric shock of contact that 7 years of separation had done nothing to diminish. In one fluid motion, he pulled her up onto the saddle behind him, her wedding dress billowing around them like clouds. The black stallion reared once, as if saluting the congregation, then wheeled toward the open doors. "Stop them!" Samuel's voice cracked with fury and disbelief. "They can't just—" But they already had. Horse and riders burst through the doorway into the blazing sunshine, leaving behind a church full of shocked faces and overturned expectations. The last thing the congregation heard was the thunder of hooves and the sound of Eliza's laughter, wild and free and absolutely certain, carried away on the morning wind. The black stallion's hooves pounded against the hard-packed earth as they fled Red Bluff, each stride carrying them further from the shocked faces and shouting voices that had erupted in their wake. Eliza clung to Jed's waist, her elaborate wedding dress streaming behind them like a white banner of rebellion. The silk and lace that had taken seamstresses months to perfect was already showing signs of their wild escape, a tear along the hem where it had caught on the church door, dust settling into the intricate beadwork, the perfect French seams beginning to strain under the demands of actual movement. For the first mile, neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the rhythmic thunder of hoofbeats, the horses' steady breathing, and the whistle of wind past their ears. Eliza found herself marveling at how right this felt, the solid warmth of Jed's back against her chest, the familiar scent of leather and pine that clung to his clothes, the sense of moving toward something instead of being carried along by forces beyond her control. When they finally slowed to give the horse a breather, Jed guided them off the main road and into a grove of cottonwoods beside a meandering creek. The sudden quiet felt almost overwhelming after the chaos of their escape. Birds called from the branches overhead, and somewhere in the distance, a hawk circled lazily on the afternoon thermals. "You came back," Eliza said softly, the words carrying 7 years of wonder and hurt and hope. Jed dismounted and turned to help her down, his hands steady on her waist as her feet touched the ground. Up close, she could see the changes that time had carved in his face, new lines around his eyes from squinting into mountain sun, a scar along his jaw that hadn't been there before, silver threading through the dark hair at his temples, but his eyes were exactly as she remembered them, grey as storm clouds and just as unpredictable. "I said I would." He reached into his saddlebags and pulled out a worn blanket, spreading it on a patch of soft grass beside the creek. Though I'll admit, the timing could have been better planned. Despite everything, Eliza found herself laughing a sound she hadn't heard from her own lips in longer than she cared to remember. The timing was perfect. 5 minutes later, and I would have been Mrs. Samuel Whitmore forever. The reality of what she had just done began to settle over her like morning mist. She had abandoned her groom at the altar, fled her own wedding, and scandalized the entire territory in the space of 10 minutes. Her reputation was in ruins, her father was probably apoplectic with rage, and she was now sitting beside a creek in a wedding dress worth more than most people earned in a year, with no clear plan for what came next. The strangest part was how little any of that seemed to matter. "Are you having second thoughts?" Jed asked, studying her face with the careful attention she remembered so well. "About leaving Samuel? No." The certainty in her voice surprised even her. "About the way I left him, maybe. He didn't deserve to be humiliated in front of the entire town. Whatever his faults, he's not a cruel man. Just the wrong man." "Yes." She smoothed the torn silk of her skirt, noting how impractical the elaborate dress was for anything more adventurous than standing in drawing rooms. "I suppose you have some grand plan for where we go from here." Jed's smile was rueful. "I had a plan for getting you away from that church. Everything after that, I figured we'd work out together." The admission should have terrified her. Instead, it felt liberating. For the first time in 7 years, she was faced with genuine uncertainty, no predetermined path, no carefully laid plans, no safety net of family expectations, just 2 people, and whatever they could make of the choices ahead. "They'll come after us," she said practically. "Samuel, my father, probably half the men in Red Bluff. This won't just be about rescuing a kidnapped bride, it'll be about defending their honor. Let them come." Jed's voice held a quiet confidence that had nothing to do with bravado. "I've spent 7 years learning every trail, every canyon, every hiding place from here to the Canadian border. They might have numbers, but I have knowledge." He pulled his silver compass from his jacket pocket, its surface gleaming in the dappled sunlight that filtered through the cottonwood leaves. The instrument was clearly old but well maintained, its brass fittings polished smooth by years of handling. "My grandfather's compass," he explained, noticing her attention. "He used it to guide wagon trains across the Oregon Trail, passed it down to my father, who used it to find the best hunting grounds in the Rockies. Now, it's mine. What does it tell you? That true north isn't always the same as the direction everyone else thinks you should go." He closed the compass and tucked it away carefully. "It's been pointing me back to you for 7 years, Eliza. Even when I tried to convince myself to move on, to build a life somewhere else, it kept pulling me home." The words hung between them, heavy with implication. This wasn't just about rescuing her from an unwanted marriage. It was about completing something that had been left unfinished, honoring promises that time and circumstances had interrupted but never broken. "Tell me about those 7 years," she said. "Where did you go? What did you do?" Jed leaned back on his elbows, his gaze following the creek's meandering path toward the mountains. "North, mostly. Spent time with the Blackfoot tribe up near Glacier Country. They taught me things about living off the land that I never would have learned otherwise. Worked as a guide for survey crews mapping the territory, trapped beaver and wolf when the weather was too bad for anything else." "It sounds lonely." It was. His honesty was like a physical touch, but it was also necessary. "I needed to become someone worthy of coming back for you. The boy you knew 7 years ago had dreams but no substance. I had to learn how to survive, how to provide, how to be the kind of man who could offer you a real life instead of just promises." Eliza thought about her own 7 years, the endless round of social obligations, the carefully orchestrated courtship with Samuel, the gradual dimming of dreams until they were mere whispers in the dark. She had become accomplished in all the ways that mattered to society, but she had lost touch with the person she had been when those dreams were bright and sharp. "I'm not the same either," she admitted. "The girl you knew was naive enough to think love could conquer anything. I've learned that the world has harder edges than I understood then. Maybe that's not such a bad thing. Maybe we both needed to grow up before we could have this conversation as equals." The sound of distant hoofbeats made them both freeze. Still far off, but getting closer, the organized rhythm of multiple horses moving at a steady pace. The posse was already forming, already following their trail. Jed was on his feet instantly, moving with the fluid efficiency of someone accustomed to thinking quickly under pressure. "We need to move. There's a place I know about 10 miles from here, a box canyon with a hidden entrance. We can lose them there and plan our next move." As he helped her back onto the horse, Eliza caught sight of herself in the creek's still water. The perfect wedding coiffure had come undone, her hair now flowing loose around her shoulders. The pristine white dress was stained with dust and grass, the elaborate train torn in several places. She looked like what she was, a woman who had chosen disruption over safety, adventure over security. The torn wedding dress, once a symbol of duty and expectation, had become something else entirely. Now, it represented her break from everything she was supposed to be, her transformation from dutiful daughter to woman, making her own choices. The expensive silk that had been crafted to display her value in the marriage market was now just fabric, practical or impractical, based on its usefulness for the journey ahead. "No regrets?" Jed asked, as they prepared to ride deeper into the wilderness. Eliza looked back toward Red Bluff, now just a smudge of dust and buildings on the horizon. Somewhere back there, her father was probably pacing his study in impotent fury. Samuel was likely drowning his humiliation in whiskey while planning his revenge. The congregation was probably still debating what they had witnessed and what it meant for the social order they had worked so hard to maintain. "None," she said, and meant it. "For the first time in 7 years, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." The stallion sprang forward at Jed's signal, carrying them away from the world of responsibilities and expectations, and toward something unknown but chosen. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew closer. But ahead lay the vast wilderness of the Montana Territory, a place where compass directions mattered more than social conventions, where survival depended on skills rather than status, and where two people could discover what they were truly capable of when freed from the expectations of others. As they rode toward the mountains, Eliza found herself thinking not about what she was leaving behind, but about what lay ahead. The torn silk of her wedding dress fluttered in the wind like a flag of independence, marking not an ending, but a beginning. The hidden canyon that Jed had promised proved to be everything he had described, a narrow cleft in the red sandstone cliffs that could only be entered through a gap barely wide enough for a horse and rider. Once inside, the walls opened up to reveal a sheltered valley with a small spring and enough grass to keep their horse content. Ancient petroglyphs decorated the smooth stone faces, suggesting that others had found refuge here long before them. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, they made camp beside the spring. Jed moved with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to making himself comfortable in the wilderness, while Eliza found herself acutely aware of how helpless her expensive education had left her in practical matters. She could recite poetry in 3 languages, play complex pieces on the piano, and navigate the intricate social protocols of frontier society. But she had no idea how to build a fire or prepare a meal from the supplies in Jed's saddlebags. "I feel utterly useless," she confessed, as she watched him arrange kindling with careful precision. The admission stung, but it was honest. "You're not useless, you're inexperienced. There's a difference." Jed struck flint to steel, coaxing sparks into the dry tinder. "Besides, usefulness isn't just about wilderness skills. You convinced an entire congregation to let us ride away without shooting me on sight. That took considerable presence of mind. They were too shocked to react properly. Give them time to organize, and they'll be considerably more dangerous." The fire caught, flames dancing up from the carefully constructed pile of sticks and dried grass. Jed sat back on his heels, satisfied with his work, then reached for his saddlebags. From inside, he pulled out a worn leather journal, its covers darkened by years of handling and weather. "What's that?" Eliza asked, settling herself on a smooth boulder beside the growing fire. "Thoughts, mostly. Sketches of places I've been, maps of useful trails, notes about weather patterns." He hesitated, then opened the journal to a page near the middle. "And some things I probably should have said 7 years ago. And could—" The page was covered with his careful handwriting, but what caught Eliza's attention were the margins, filled with detailed sketches of a woman's face, her face captured from memory with an artist's attention to detail. There she was in profile, laughing at something beyond the paper's edge. There she was, looking thoughtful, her chin resting on her hand. There she was sleeping, peaceful and unguarded. "You drew these from memory. I was afraid I'd forget." His voice was quiet, almost ashamed, afraid that time would blur the details until you became just another pleasant memory instead of what? Instead of the thing that made everything else feel like waiting. The words hit her like a physical force, stealing her breath with their simple honesty. She turned the pages carefully, finding more sketches interspersed with maps and notes about hunting seasons. Here was the old oak tree where they used to meet, rendered in precise detail. Here was the creek where they had shared their first kiss, complete with the boulder where she had perched, while he explained the difference between deer and elk tracks. "I kept something too," she admitted, thinking of the pressed wildflower hidden in her jewelry box back in Red Bluff. "A purple flower from the meadow where you told me about the Oregon Trail. I pressed it in my jewelry box and kept it all these years." "Why?" "For the same reason you drew these pictures. Because I was afraid of forgetting, and because some part of me never stopped believing that someday—" She didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. The understanding that passed between them was complete, encompassing 7 years of parallel longing, and the strange magic of finding that their separate paths had led them back to the same place. "Tell me what really happened," she said. "The day you left Red Bluff, my father said you'd taken a job in California, that you'd decided there was no future for us, but these drawings suggest otherwise." Jed closed the journal carefully and set it aside, his expression growing troubled. "Your father and I had a conversation that day. He made it clear that any relationship between us would result in serious consequences, not just for me, but for you. He had the power to destroy my family's livelihood, to make sure I never found work anywhere in the territory. But more than that, he convinced me that staying would only hurt you in the long run." "What do you mean?" "He pointed out that I had nothing to offer you except uncertainty and hardship. No money, no property, no standing in the community. He said that if I truly cared about your welfare, I would let you find a husband who could provide for you properly." Eliza felt a familiar anger rising in her chest, not at Jed, but at the manipulation that had torn them apart. "And you believed him?" "I was 24 years old, Eliza. I'd grown up watching my father struggle to feed our family on a trapper's uncertain income. I'd seen what happened to women who married men without resources. They aged before their time, bore children they couldn't properly clothe, lived in constant fear of the next bad season or injury that could leave them destitute. So you left to protect me from poverty. I left to become someone worthy of you. Your father made it clear that if I could come back in 5 years with money in my pocket and land to my name, he might reconsider his opposition. He seemed to think that was impossible, that I'd never amount to more than a drifter with good intentions. But you did it. Jed's smile was grim. I did it. Bought a section of prime grazing land in the valley north of here, built a cabin that's small but solid, put together a herd of cattle that's modest but growing. I've got money in the bank in Helena and connections with buyers as far east as Chicago. By any reasonable measure, I'm now a suitable prospect for marriage. Then why didn't you come back through proper channels? Why the dramatic rescue? Because I came back 6 months ago to ask for your hand properly, and I learned about your engagement to Samuel Whitmore. His voice carried a bitterness that made her heart ache. Your father informed me that my window of opportunity had closed, that you had moved on to more appropriate prospects. He suggested I do the same. The pieces fell into place with painful clarity. Her father had manipulated both of them, using Jed's youth and inexperience against him, then using the passage of time to justify his refusal to honor their original agreement. The engagement to Samuel had been arranged not just for financial reasons, but to permanently close the door on a relationship that Charles Thornton had never intended to allow. He never told me you'd come back, Eliza said, her voice tight with suppressed fury. If I had known, what would you have done? You were already engaged, the wedding planned, the announcements made. Breaking off with Samuel would have caused a scandal almost as big as what we did today. I would have chosen you. The words came out with absolute certainty. I would have chosen you then, just as I chose you today. They sat in silence for a moment, watching the fire burn down to glowing coals while the implications of her father's deception settled between them. In the distance, they could hear the faint sounds of horses moving through the canyon country, their pursuers still searching, but not yet close enough to pose immediate danger. What happens now? Eliza asked. We can't hide in canyons forever, and eventually they'll organize a proper search. Samuel has connections throughout the territory. My father has resources and determination. They won't give up easily. No, they won't. Jed poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling up into the darkening sky. But I've got advantages they don't expect. Friends among the Indian tribes who can hide our trail when necessary. Knowledge of country they've never seen, and something they don't have. Which is you. He looked at her directly, his grey eyes reflecting the firelight. They're chasing what they think. You are a helpless society lady who needs to be rescued from her own poor judgment. They don't understand that you're here because you chose to be here. Eliza thought about that, examining the truth of it. For 7 years, she had been what others expected her to be, the dutiful daughter, the accomplished young lady, the suitable bride. But sitting here beside a campfire in the wilderness, wearing a torn wedding dress and planning an uncertain future with a man who had spent years earning the right to love her, she felt more like herself than she had since she was 21. Teach me, she said suddenly. Teach you what? Everything. How to build fires, how to cook over open flames, how to read weather signs and animal tracks. How to survive in places where social accomplishments don't matter. She gestured at her elaborate dress, now hopelessly stained and torn. I can't spend the rest of my life being a burden. If we're going to make this work, I need to become someone who can pull her own weight. Jed's expression shifted from surprise to something deeper respect, perhaps, mixed with the kind of admiration that had nothing to do with social position or inherited advantages. It won't be easy, he warned. The kind of life I'm offering you is harder than anything you've known. Winters in the high country can be brutal. There'll be times when we have to choose between comfort and safety, between civilization and freedom. I understand, and surprisingly, she did. The choice she had made wasn't just about choosing love over security, it was about choosing authenticity over expectation, growth over stagnation, partnership over dependence. As if to seal their bargain, Jed reached for his journal again and tore out one of the sketches, the one of her laughing, caught in a moment of pure joy that she barely remembered feeling. He handed it to her, and she studied the image of a woman who looked both familiar and strange, someone she had once been and might be again. "Keep it," he said, "to remind you of who you are when the world tries to convince you to be someone else." The sound of distant gunshots echoed off the canyon walls. Signal shots, probably, as the search parties tried to coordinate their efforts. Their sanctuary wouldn't remain hidden much longer. "Time to move," Jed said, already kicking dirt over the dying fire. As they prepared to ride deeper into the wilderness, Eliza tucked the sketch into the bodice of her dress, feeling it rest against her heart like a promise. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new lessons in survival, new tests of their commitment to each other and to the life they were trying to build. But tonight, under a canopy of stars that seemed close enough to touch, she felt something she hadn't experienced in 7 years, hope that was entirely her own, earned through choice rather than granted through circumstance. The torn wedding dress that had marked her transformation was no longer white. It was the color of adventure, stained with dust and smoke, and the honest sweat of making real decisions. And that, she thought, as they rode out of the hidden canyon and into the unknown, was exactly how it should be. 3 days into their flight from Red Bluff, they encountered their first real test when they came upon a family of travelers whose wagon had thrown a wheel on the rocky trail that wound through Devil's Canyon. The man, middle-aged, with the weathered look of someone who had spent years fighting the frontier for his living, was struggling to jack up the heavy wagon while his wife attempted to keep their 3 young children calm and out of the way. Jed's first instinct was clearly to ride around the obstacle and avoid any contact that might lead to their identification. But Eliza touched his arm gently, and something in her expression made him pull up short. "We can't just leave them," she said quietly. "That wheel isn't going to fix itself, and they're hours from the nearest settlement. Eliza, if they recognize you, then we'll deal with that when it happens." She was already dismounting before he could protest further. "Some things matter more than our safety." The family's name was Patterson, and they were heading west from Kansas with dreams of starting fresh in the Oregon Territory. Tom Patterson had the calloused hands of a farmer and the stubborn jaw of a man who had never backed down from hard work. His wife, Sarah, possessed the kind of quiet strength that Eliza recognized from her own mother, the ability to hold a family together through sheer force of will and boundless love. "Ma'am, you shouldn't trouble yourself," Tom protested as Eliza knelt beside Sarah to help comfort the youngest child, a girl of perhaps 4 who had scraped her knee when the wagon lurched. "We'll manage well enough." But Eliza was already tearing strips from her petticoat to clean the child's wound, her hands moving with surprising competence. The past 3 days with Jed had awakened skills she hadn't known. She possessed practical knowledge that her expensive education had never included, but that seemed to emerge naturally when necessity demanded it. "What's your name, sweetheart?" she asked the little girl, whose tears had stopped as soon as a grown-up paid attention to her distress. "Mary," the child whispered, then added with the brutal honesty of the very young, "You're the prettiest lady I ever saw, but your dress is all dirty." Eliza laughed, a sound that had been coming more easily with each day away from Red Bluff. "That's because I've been having adventures, Mary. Sometimes adventures are messy." While she tended to the children, Jed and Tom worked together to repair the wagon wheel, a process that required both mechanical skill and considerable strength. Watching them collaborate, Eliza was struck by how naturally Jed fit into the role of helper and protector, how his years in the wilderness had taught him not just survival, but genuine care for others in need. "You folks heading anywhere particular?" Tom asked, as they wrestled the repaired wheel back into position. His tone was casual, but Eliza caught the undertone of curiosity that made her pulse quicken. "North," Jed replied non-committally. "Got some business in the mining country." Sarah Patterson, however, was studying Eliza with the sharp eyes of a woman who had raised 3 children and could spot trouble from considerable distance. "That's quite a dress for traveling rough country," she observed. "Looks like it might have been made for something special." The moment stretched taut as Eliza felt the weight of discovery pressing down on them. Her torn wedding dress was distinctive enough that anyone with a passing familiarity with fine clothing would recognize it for what it was. And if the Patterson family had passed through Red Bluff recently, they might even have heard about the scandal that had rocked the territory 3 days prior. "It was my mother's," Eliza said, surprised by how easily the lie came to her lips. "She always said that life's too short to save your best dress for special occasions, so I wear it when I travel," in her memory. The explanation seemed to satisfy Sarah, whose expression softened with sympathy. But as they prepared to part ways, Tom Patterson pulled a newspaper from his wagon and offered it to Jed. "Week-old paper from Red Bluff," he said. "Figured you might like to catch up on the news from civilization." Eliza's blood turned to ice as she saw the headline blazed across the front page: "Local Heiress Kidnapped from Own Wedding." Below, it was a detailed account of the events at the church, complete with a description of the desperado who had perpetrated the crime and a substantial reward offered for information leading to their capture. "Terrible thing," Tom continued, apparently unaware of the bombshell he had just delivered. "Can't imagine what kind of man would steal a woman from her own wedding. Must be some kind of savage." "Terrible indeed," Jed agreed, his voice steady despite the tension that had suddenly gripped them both. "The world's full of dangerous people these days." They said their goodbyes with careful politeness, but Eliza could feel Sarah Patterson's eyes following them as they rode away. The woman was no fool, and the coincidence of encountering well-dressed travelers in the wilderness so soon after reading about a kidnapping would not escape her notice for long. "How long do you think we have before they put it together?" Eliza asked once they were out of earshot. "Not long." Tom seemed genuinely oblivious, but his wife is sharp. "She'll be studying that newspaper again tonight, and by morning she'll have figured out who we really are. Will they turn us in?" Jed considered the question as they guided their horse up a steep switchback that led deeper into the mountains. "Hard to say. Tom strikes me as the kind of man who minds his own business unless directly threatened. But the reward money would go a long way toward financing their new start in Oregon." The newspaper had contained other troubling information as well. Samuel Whitmore had put up $500 of his own money, a fortune by frontier standards, for their capture. Charles Thornton had matched that amount and thrown in an additional 100 for information leading to Eliza's safe return. More ominously, they had enlisted the help of a professional tracker named Jake Morrison, a man whose reputation for finding fugitives was legendary throughout the territory. "Morrison's good," Jed admitted when Eliza asked about the tracker. "Probably the best manhunter west of the Mississippi. If anyone can follow our trail through this country, it's him." "You sound like you know him personally." "We've crossed paths before. He tracked down a horse thief I was guiding for about 3 years back. Took him 6 days to corner his quarry in country that should have provided plenty of hiding places. The man doesn't give up, and he doesn't make mistakes." They rode in silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts about the implications of professional pursuit. The game had changed from a simple manhunt by angry townspeople to a systematic tracking operation backed by serious money and expertise. The romance of their escape was giving way to the cold reality of being hunted. As the sun began to set behind the western peaks, they made camp in a grove of aspen trees beside a small mountain lake. The setting was achingly beautiful, mirror-still water reflecting the last light of day. Snow-capped peaks rising like cathedral spires against the darkening sky, the gentle whisper of wind through golden leaves that trembled at the slightest breath. But Eliza found it difficult to appreciate the beauty when her mind was occupied with more practical concerns. She pulled her father's gold pocket watch from the small bag of personal items she had managed to salvage from her wedding preparations, one of the few things of value she possessed that might be useful for trade or sale. The watch had been a gift from her grandfather to her father on his wedding day, passed down through 3 generations of Thornton men who had built their fortune through careful planning and relentless ambition. Its solid gold case was engraved with the family crest, and its precise Swiss movement had kept perfect time through decades of frontier life. In Red Bluff, it represented legacy, continuity, the weight of family expectations carried forward through time. Out here, it was simply a valuable object that might buy them supplies or safe passage when other resources ran low. "That's a beautiful piece," Jed observed, noticing her contemplation of the timepiece. "It was my grandfather's, then my father's. He gave it to me when I turned 18, said it would help me remember that time is the most precious thing we possess because it can never be recovered once spent." Wise advice. Yes, but I'm not sure he meant it the way I'm interpreting it now. She closed the watch and tucked it away carefully. He thought time should be spent building security, accumulating wealth, establishing position in society. But sitting here with you, watching the sun set over mountains that don't care about bank accounts or social standing, I think he had it backwards. How so? Time isn't meant to be spent building walls against uncertainty. It's meant to be spent living, really living, not just existing within the boundaries other people set for us. Jed was quiet for a long moment, his grey eyes reflecting the firelight as he considered her words. That's a dangerous philosophy for someone raised in comfort and security. Maybe. But what's the alternative? Spend my whole life wondering what might have been if I'd had the courage to choose differently. She gestured toward the vast wilderness that surrounded them. Out here, I feel more alive than I have in years. More myself. More what? More like the person I was meant to be, instead of the person I was trained to be. As if to underscore her point, a wolf howled somewhere in the distance, a sound both wild and lonely, calling to something primitive and untamed that civilization tried its best to suppress. The sound raised goosebumps along Eliza's arms, but not from fear. Instead, she felt a strange kinship with that distant voice, an understanding of what it meant to claim one's place in the world through strength and cunning, rather than inheritance and expectation. "Your father won't see it that way," Jed warned gently. "To him, this will look like his daughter, throwing away everything he worked to provide for her." "I know, and I'm sorry for that, sorrier than you can imagine. But I can't live his dreams, Jed. I tried for 7 years, and it nearly killed everything real inside me." The gold pocket watch seemed to grow heavier in her pocket as she spoke, weighted not just with precious metal, but with the expectations of generations. Tomorrow, they would need to make hard decisions about their route, their destination, their strategy for staying ahead of professional trackers. The watch might prove useful for those purposes, but tonight it served as a reminder of everything she was choosing to leave behind. "No regrets?" Jed asked, echoing his question from their first day together. Eliza looked around at their simple camp bedrolls, spread beside a dying fire, their horse grazing peacefully in the moonlight, stars beginning to emerge in the vast dome of sky above them. 3 days ago, she had been preparing to sleep in her childhood bedroom for the last time before moving to Samuel Whitmore's grand house with its imported furniture and manicured gardens. She had been surrounded by every comfort money could buy, every security that careful planning could provide. "None," she said, and meant it more than ever. The gold watch might represent family legacy, but this moment sitting beside a mountain lake with a man who had spent 7 years earning the right to love her represented something far more valuable. The chance to write her own story, instead of living one that had been written for her. The distant wolf howled again, and this time Eliza found herself smiling at the sound. The morning brought an unexpected encounter that would change the trajectory of their flight entirely. As they broke camp beside the mountain lake, the sound of approaching horses sent them both reaching for weapons. Jed for the rifle in his saddle scabbard, Eliza for the small pistol he had given her the day before, with instructions on its use. But the riders, who emerged from the tree line, were not the pursuit party they had been expecting. Instead, 3 Native American men approached on painted ponies, their movements unhurried and their expressions curious rather than hostile. The leader, a man of perhaps 50 with silver threading through his long black hair, raised his hand in the universal gesture of peaceful greeting. "Jedediah Cole," the man said in accented but clear English. "It has been too many winters since you walked among us." Jed's tension visibly relaxed as recognition dawned. "Running Bear, I was hoping I might find you in this country." The exchange that followed was conducted partly in English and partly in what Eliza assumed was Blackfoot, with occasional gestures and expressions that transcended language entirely. It became clear that Jed's relationship with these men went far beyond casual acquaintance. There was a warmth and familiarity that spoke of deep friendship and mutual respect. "My friend says the valley spirits are restless," Running Bear eventually explained to Eliza, who had been listening with fascination to the musical cadences of the unfamiliar language. Many riders search the low country, asking questions about a white man and woman. They offer much money for word of your passing. "How much money?" Jed asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer wouldn't be encouraging. "Enough to buy many horses, much ammunition." Running Bear's expression grew serious. "The man who leads them is known to us, the one called Morrison. He has tracked many fugitives through our lands, always with success. He shows no respect for the old boundaries, claims the white man's law reaches everywhere the white man's foot has stepped." Eliza felt her heart sink. If Morrison was already this close to their trail, if he was offering rewards substantial enough to tempt even the Native American tribes who had no particular loyalty to territorial law enforcement, their situation was far more precarious than she had realized. "There is more," Running Bear continued. "Morrison brings with him papers that say the woman was taken against her will, that she is in great danger and must be returned to her family for her own protection. He claims Jedediah Cole is a dangerous man who has stolen something precious that does not belong to him." The characterization stung, not because it was inaccurate from a legal standpoint. She had, after all, been technically kidnapped from her own wedding, but because it reduced her choice to mere victimhood, as if her own will in the matter was irrelevant. "What do you think?" Jed asked his friend directly. "Are we safe in your country?" Running Bear was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes studying both of them, with the careful assessment of a man accustomed to making life-and-death decisions based on incomplete information. Finally, he turned to Eliza. "The papers say you were taken against your will. Is this truth?" The question hung in the morning air like smoke from their dying campfire. Eliza realized that her answer would determine not just their immediate safety, but the nature of their relationship with people who might prove to be their only allies in the vast wilderness. "No," she said clearly. "I chose to leave. Jed gave me the opportunity to escape a life that was killing my spirit, but the choice was mine." Running Bear nodded slowly, as if her answer confirmed something he had already suspected. The spirits spoke truly. "Then, they said this was not a taking, but a choosing. Not a theft, but a reclaiming." He reached into a leather pouch at his waist and withdrew something that made Eliza's breath catch, a carved stone pipe, its bowl shaped like an eagle's head and its stem decorated with intricate beadwork. The craftsmanship was exquisite, clearly the work of master artisans, and the way Running Bear handled it suggested it held significant ceremonial importance. "This belonged to my grandfather's grandfather," he explained, as he prepared the pipe with tobacco and herbs. It has been smoked in councils where great decisions were made, where truths were spoken that changed the course of many lives. Today, we smoke it to honor your choosing and to welcome you into the protection of our people. The ceremony that followed was unlike anything Eliza had experienced in her years of formal religious observance. There were no written liturgies or prescribed responses, no Gothic arches or stained glass windows. Instead, there was simply the open sky, the mountain air, and the profound sense of connection that came from sharing something sacred with people who understood the difference between rules and wisdom. As the pipe passed between them, Running Bear spoke of the old ways, when the land belonged to no one and everyone, when people moved freely across vast distances according to the rhythms of seasons and the calling of their hearts. He told stories of his own youth, when tribal boundaries were fluid and marriage often meant joining not just two people but two ways of life. In the old days, he said, a woman who was not happy in her father's lodge could seek sanctuary with another tribe, could choose a new path without shame or punishment. The white man's law does not understand this, thinks all women are property to be owned and controlled. His words resonated with something deep in Eliza's understanding, a recognition that her flight from Red Bluff was part of a much older pattern of resistance to constraints that denied the fundamental human right to choose one's own destiny. Morrison will not give up easily, Running Bear warned as the ceremony concluded. He has great skill and much determination, but he does not know all the paths through this country, and he does not understand the ways of people who value choosing over owning. The conversation that followed revealed the extent of Jed's integration into the tribal community during his years in the mountains. He had been formally adopted into Running Bear's band after proving his worth as a hunter and his reliability as a friend. He had learned their languages, their customs, their intimate knowledge of the land that had sustained them for countless generations. Your man has walked between two worlds for many seasons, Running Bear told Eliza. He has white skin but an Indian heart, understands both the white man's need for ownership and the red man's wisdom of belonging. This makes him valuable but also dangerous to those who think all people must choose only one way of living. As they prepared to part ways, Running Bear offered them something more precious than gold, safe passage through tribal lands and a network of allies who could help them disappear completely if necessary. But the gift came with a price. They would need to abandon entirely the world they had known and commit themselves to a life that existed in the spaces between cultures, in the vast territories that no government had yet claimed or mapped. There is a place, he explained, 3 days' ride north and west, where a valley opens that is known only to our people. Good water, sweet grass, game enough to sustain a small band through the hardest winters. You could build a life there that no white man's law could touch, raise children who would know both worlds, but belong fully to neither. The offer was tempting beyond words, a chance to escape permanently from the complications of their situation, to create something entirely new in a place where their past would be irrelevant. But Eliza found herself hesitating, not from fear of the unknown, but from a growing understanding that running away permanently might not be the answer she was seeking. "What about the people we left behind?" she asked. "My father, the families in Red Bluff who knew us before all this started. If we disappear completely, they'll spend the rest of their lives wondering what happened, whether we're dead or alive, whether we're happy or suffering." Jed looked at her with surprise and something that might have been admiration. "You're thinking about going back?" "Not to stay," she clarified quickly, "but to face what we've done, to explain ourselves, to give people the chance to understand that this wasn't a crime but a choice." Running Bear smiled at her words, the expression transforming his weathered features. "The young woman speaks with old wisdom. Sometimes the bravest path is not the one that leads away from trouble, but the one that leads through it to the other side." He gave them the peace pipe as a parting gift, its significance extending far beyond its material value. It represented acceptance into a community that transcended bloodlines and birth, acknowledgement that some bonds were chosen rather than inherited, and the promise that sanctuary would always be available if they needed it. "Carry this," he said as he placed the pipe in Jed's hands. "When you are ready to choose between running and standing, between hiding and declaring, it will remind you that some things are worth fighting for, and some choices are worth defending no matter what the cost." As they watched the three riders disappear into the vast landscape, Eliza felt something shift inside her understanding of their situation. They were no longer simply fugitives, fleeing an unwanted fate. They had become something more complex and potentially more powerful. They were people who had made a conscious choice to live according to their own values rather than society's expectations, and that choice had given them allies in unexpected places. The peace pipe rested in their saddlebags like a talisman, its carved eagle head pointing the way toward a future that would require courage of a different kind than she had ever imagined. Not the courage to run or hide, but the courage to stand and be counted, to defend their right to choose love over security, authenticity over approval. The morning sun climbed higher over the mountains, burning off the mist that had clung to the lake's surface and revealing the vast landscape that stretched endlessly in all directions. Somewhere out there, Morrison and his tracking party were following their trail with professional persistence. Somewhere behind them, Red Bluff continued its daily routines, altered forever by the disruption they had caused. But here, in this moment, they were exactly where they belonged together, free and finally ready to stop running from their choices and start defending them instead. The capture came at dawn on their 7th day of freedom, not through superior tracking or tactical brilliance, but through simple betrayal and bad luck. They had made the mistake of seeking shelter in what appeared to be an abandoned line shack during a sudden mountain storm, only to discover too late that the building was being used as a supply cache by Morrison's tracking party. Eliza woke to the sound of rifles being cocked and found herself staring down the barrels of 3 weapons held by grim-faced men who looked like they hadn't slept properly in a week. Beside her, Jed had his hands raised, but his eyes were calculating, searching for any opportunity that might present itself. "Easy now," said the man in the center, whose badge identified him as a territorial marshal. "Nobody needs to get hurt here. Miss Thornton, you're safe now. We're going to take you home." The word home hit her like a physical blow, carrying with it all the implications of return to a life she had already outgrown. But before she could respond, the door of the line shack banged open to admit 2 more figures, Samuel Whitmore and Jake Morrison himself. Samuel looked haggard, his normally immaculate appearance disheveled by days in the saddle. His pale blue eyes, which had always seemed cool but not unkind, now burned with something that might have been fury, or wounded pride, or simple exhaustion. Morrison, by contrast, appeared completely unaffected by the pursuit, a lean, weathered man in his 40s, whose reputation for relentless tracking was evidently well-deserved. "There she is," Samuel said, his voice tight with controlled emotion. "My bride, stolen from our wedding by this mountain savage." The characterization of Jed made Eliza's temper flare. "He's not a savage, and I wasn't stolen. I chose to leave, Samuel. I chose him over you because you've been confused and frightened by your ordeal." Samuel interrupted smoothly. "It's perfectly understandable, my dear. Stockholm Syndrome, the doctors call it, when victims begin to identify with their captors as a way of coping with trauma." The clinical explanation dismissed her agency so completely that for a moment she was speechless. In Samuel's version of events, she had no capacity for independent thought or genuine emotion. She was simply a victim whose responses could be explained away by medical terminology. "That's not what happened," she said firmly. "I left because I was about to marry a man I didn't love, for reasons that had nothing to do with my happiness or well-being." Morrison stepped forward, his cold eyes moving between her and Jed with the dispassionate assessment of a man accustomed to evaluating threats. "Ma'am, with respect, what you think happened and what actually happened may be two different things. Cole here has a history of questionable associations and violent behavior. He's been living rough for years, consorting with hostile Indians, operating outside the boundaries of civilized society." "The Blackfoot aren't hostile," Eliza protested. "They're kind, honorable people who helped you evade lawful pursuit," Morrison cut her off, "which makes them accessories to kidnapping under territorial law." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of more riders, a full dozen men, including Charles Thornton and several prominent citizens of Red Bluff. Her father looked older than she remembered, his face lined with worry and exhaustion, but his eyes lit with relief when he saw her apparently unharmed. "Eliza, thank God." He dismounted and approached the line shack, his movements stiff with fatigue. "When that savage took you from the church, I thought," his voice broke slightly, "I thought I might never see you again." The genuine emotion in his voice made her heart ache, but it also strengthened her resolve. "I'm sorry you worried, Father, but I'm not a victim, and Jed isn't a criminal. We're two people who love each other and who were prevented from being together by circumstances we couldn't control." "Love?" Samuel's voice carried a bitter edge. "You think this is about love? My dear girl, you've been deceived by a fortune hunter who saw an opportunity to get his hands on the Thornton inheritance." "That's not true," she began, but Samuel was already reaching into his saddlebags to withdraw a leather portfolio. "Mr. Morrison has done some very interesting research into your boyfriend's background," he continued, his tone growing more confident. "Tell her, Morrison. Tell her what you discovered about Cole's finances." Morrison opened the portfolio and withdrew several documents, his expression neutral but his meaning clear. Jedediah Cole currently owes substantial sums to creditors in Helena, Butte, and Billings. His ranch, which he claims to own free and clear, is mortgaged to the hilt. His cattle herd was sold last month to cover gambling debts accumulated in Denver saloons. Each revelation hit Eliza like a physical blow. "That's not possible," he told me. "He told you what you wanted to hear," Samuel finished. "A romantic story about earning your love through years of hard work and honest living. The truth is rather more sordid." Morrison continued his recitation with clinical precision. "Cole's been living on credit and false promises for 2 years. The ranch he described to you was sold to pay debts 6 months ago. The man's bankrupt, Miss Thornton, and has been looking for a way to solve his financial problems. Your inheritance would have done that very nicely. But the most devastating revelation was yet to come." Morrison reached deeper into the portfolio and withdrew a final document, a marriage certificate dated 3 years prior, bearing Jed's signature and that of a woman named Maria Santos from a town in Colorado Territory. "Your devoted suitor is already married," Morrison announced with grim satisfaction. "Which means that even if his motives were pure, which they clearly weren't, any relationship between you would be both illegal and immoral." The silence that followed this announcement was absolute. Eliza felt the world tilting around her, all her certainties crumbling like a house built on shifting sand. She turned to look at Jed, searching his face for some explanation, some denial that would make sense of the contradiction between the man she thought she knew and the evidence being presented against him. But Jed's expression was unreadable, his grey eyes giving nothing away. He didn't deny the charges, didn't protest his innocence, didn't offer any of the explanations she desperately needed to hear. "Is it true?" she whispered. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, with a voice so quiet she had to strain to hear it, he spoke a single word. "Yes." The confession hit her harder than any physical blow could have. Not just the betrayal itself, but the completeness of it, the elaborate fiction he had constructed, the careful manipulation of her emotions, the cynical calculation behind what she had believed was spontaneous passion. "The marriage certificate is real," he continued, his tone flat and emotionless. I married Maria Santos 3 years ago. We separated after 6 months, but we never divorced. And the debts, most of them are real too. I owe money all over the territory. But why? The question came out as barely more than a breath. Why construct such an elaborate deception? Samuel answered before Jed could respond. Because your inheritance is worth more than everything he owes and everything he's lost combined. Because marrying you, or even appearing to elope with you, would have given him access to resources that could solve all his problems at once. And if that didn't work, Morrison added, he could always hold you for ransom. Charles Thornton's daughter would be worth a considerable sum to the right buyer. The implications of this statement made Eliza's blood run cold. Not just betrayal, but the possibility that she had been nothing more than merchandise to be stolen and sold. The romance, the passion, the carefully crafted story of eternal love, all of it, a performance designed to manipulate her into compliance. Charles Thornton stepped forward, his face a mixture of relief and fury. Thank God we found you before this went any further. Samuel is willing to overlook this entire unfortunate incident, to proceed with the wedding as if nothing happened. Your reputation can be salvaged if we act quickly. My reputation? Eliza's voice sounded strange in her own ears, hollow and distant. The story we'll tell is that you were kidnapped and held against your will, that you escaped at the first opportunity and made your way back to civilization. A few weeks of recovery from your ordeal, a quiet wedding ceremony, and this whole nightmare can be put behind us. The neat solution wrapped around her like a shroud. Her choices, her agency, her very capacity for independent thought, all of it erased by a narrative that reduced her to a passive victim rescued by the men who knew what was best for her. But even as the walls of her old life began to close around her again, even as the evidence of Jed's betrayal burned like acid in her chest, something inside her rebelled against the tidy resolution being offered. "No," she said quietly. "What?" Her father's eyebrows drew together in confusion. "No," she repeated, louder this time. "I won't pretend this didn't happen. I won't go back to Red Bluff and marry Samuel and live the rest of my life wondering what might have been if I'd had the courage to choose differently." "Eliza, you're in shock," Samuel said with practiced patience. "You're not thinking clearly. Once you've had time to process what this man did to you, what this man did to me was show me that there was another way to live." The words came out with more force than she had intended, carrying 7 days of accumulated certainty. Yes, he lied to me about his circumstances. Yes, he deceived me about his marriage. But he didn't deceive me about the most important thing, which was, Morrison's voice carried professional skepticism, that I was dying inside that life in Red Bluff. That I was becoming someone I didn't recognize, someone who went through the motions of living without ever feeling fully alive. She looked directly at her father as she spoke. He may have lied about everything else, but he told the truth about that. The forged documents that Morrison had produced with such theatrical timing, the falsified financial records, the conveniently discovered marriage certificate, the carefully constructed narrative of deception and greed had served their purpose perfectly. They had shattered her faith in Jed completely, destroyed any possibility of romantic reconciliation. But they had also done something their creators hadn't intended. They had forced her to confront the real question at the heart of her situation. Was her choice to leave Red Bluff valid only if Jed turned out to be the perfect romantic hero she had imagined him to be? Or was it valid simply because it was her choice, made by someone capable of determining her own fate? "I want to go home," she said finally. Relief flooded the faces of the men surrounding her. Her father stepped forward with his arms outstretched, ready to embrace his wayward daughter and begin the process of damage control that would restore their family's reputation. "But," she continued, stepping back from his embrace, "I want to go home to face the consequences of my choices, not to pretend they never happened. And I want to go home as someone who finally understands the difference between security and happiness, between doing what's expected and doing what's right." The forged marriage certificate in Morrison's hands represented more than just evidence of Jed's deception. It represented the lengths to which powerful men would go to maintain control over women's choices. The elaborate fiction they had constructed to discredit him revealed more about their own desperation than about his guilt. But that was a realization that would have to wait for another day, another conversation, another reckoning with the forces that had shaped her life from birth. For now, she was simply a woman who had learned the hardest lesson of all, that sometimes the courage to choose for yourself is more important than whether you choose correctly. The ride back to Red Bluff took 3 days, during which Eliza was treated with the careful solicitude reserved for invalids and madwomen. She rode in a wagon specially requisitioned for her comfort, surrounded by men who spoke in hushed tones about her ordeal and her remarkable resilience in the face of deception and danger. Jed rode separately, his wrists bound, under heavy guard that Morrison insisted was necessary, given his desperate character and violent tendencies. They didn't speak during the journey, couldn't speak, given the circumstances, but Eliza found herself watching him with a mixture of confusion and growing suspicion. The man she observed bore little resemblance to the calculating predator described in Morrison's documents. His behavior under captivity was neither defiant nor pleading, but resigned in a way that suggested someone who had expected this outcome from the beginning. More troubling still were the small inconsistencies she began to notice in the evidence against him. The marriage certificate, while bearing official-looking seals and signatures, was dated during a period when she distinctly remembered Jed being in the Montana Territory. She had seen him from a distance during a town celebration that coincided exactly with his supposed wedding in Colorado. The financial documents, too, seemed oddly pristine for papers that should have been handled by multiple creditors and court officials. But her growing doubts about the evidence were overshadowed by more immediate concerns about what awaited her in Red Bluff. Word of their return had been sent ahead, and she could only imagine the mixture of relief, scandal, and morbid curiosity that would greet her homecoming. The story of her kidnapping and rescue would become legend, told and retold, until the truth became irrelevant compared to the dramatic narrative that served everyone's interests. Everyone's interests except her own. On the evening before their scheduled arrival in town, she was sitting beside the campfire, ostensibly reading a book that Samuel had thoughtfully provided for her entertainment, when Martha Caldwell approached their camp. Martha was the widow of Red Bluff's former sheriff, a woman known for her practical wisdom and her complete lack of tolerance for nonsense from anyone, regardless of their social position. "Miss Eliza," Martha said quietly, settling herself on a log beside the wagon. "Might I have a word?" Samuel looked up from his own reading with mild annoyance. "Mrs. Caldwell, I think Miss Thornton has been through quite enough without subjecting her to unnecessary conversations. She needs rest and quiet to recover from her ordeal." "What she needs," Martha replied tartly, "is someone to talk sense into her before she makes the biggest mistake of her life, and I reckon I'm about the only person here who's willing to do it." She reached into her reticule and withdrew a small iron key, its surface darkened with age, but its shape unmistakable, a jail cell key. "Found this in my late husband's effects when I was cleaning out his desk. Thought it might come in handy someday." The implications of Martha's words sent a chill through Eliza's understanding. The older woman wasn't here by accident, wasn't simply offering comfort to a traumatized victim. She was here with purpose, with knowledge, and with the means to act on both. "Mrs. Caldwell," Samuel's voice carried a warning edge, "I'm not sure what you're implying, but—" "I'm not implying anything, Mr. Whitmore. I'm stating facts." Martha's eyes never left Eliza's face as she spoke. "Fact 1. That marriage certificate Morrison's been waving around is a forgery, and not even a good one. My late husband dealt with enough legal documents to spot fake paper from 50 yards away, and he taught me to do the same." Eliza's breath caught. "How can you be certain?" Because the woman supposedly married to Cole Maria Santos died in a cholera outbreak in Colorado 2 years before that certificate was supposedly signed. I know because she was my sister's daughter, and I went to her funeral myself. The revelation hit the camp like a thunderclap. Samuel started to protest, but Martha continued relentlessly. Fact 2. Those financial documents showing Cole's supposed debts? Half the creditors listed don't exist, and the other half have never heard of him. I spent the better part of a week sending telegrams and checking records while you all were off playing heroes in the wilderness. That's impossible, Morrison interjected, stepping closer to the fire. I obtained those documents from official sources. You obtained them from someone who wanted Cole discredited. And you didn't bother to verify them because they told you what you wanted to hear. Martha's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to cutting through deception to reach truth. The question is, why? Why go to such elaborate lengths to destroy a man's reputation unless you had something very important to hide? The silence that followed was heavy with implication. Charles Thornton, who had been listening from the edge of the firelight, stepped forward with the measured pace of a man whose careful plans were beginning to unravel. Mrs. Caldwell, you're making very serious accusations without proof. Am I? Then perhaps you'd like to explain why Samuel Whitmore's ranch is mortgaged to the hilt, why his cattle operation has been losing money for 3 years running, and why he's been borrowing against future earnings that depend entirely on marrying a woman with a substantial inheritance. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from the dying fire. Samuel's face had gone white, then red, then white again, as the implications of Martha's investigation became clear. That's a complete fabrication, he sputtered. My financial situation is sound, my ranch is profitable. Your ranch is 3 months away from foreclosure, Martha stated flatly. Your creditors have been patient because they expected your marriage to Miss Thornton to provide the capital needed to service your debts. Without that marriage, you're facing bankruptcy and the loss of everything you've spent 20 years building. Eliza felt the pieces of a much larger puzzle beginning to fall into place. The elaborate deception about Jed's character wasn't just about discrediting a romantic rival, it was about protecting a business arrangement that had nothing to do with love or even compatibility. And you, Mr. Thornton, Martha continued, turning her attention to Eliza's father, have been just as complicit in this deception. Your bank holds the notes on Whitmore's ranch, doesn't it? If he can't marry your daughter and gain access to her inheritance, you're looking at substantial losses when his operation fails. Charles Thornton's expression shifted from outrage to something more complex shame, perhaps, mixed with the defensive anger of a man whose carefully constructed plans were crumbling in public. My daughter's welfare has always been my primary concern, he said stiffly. Your daughter's welfare or your bank's portfolio? Martha's question cut straight to the heart of the matter, because from where I sit, it looks like you've been willing to sacrifice her happiness to protect your own financial interests. The confrontation was interrupted by a commotion from the area where Jed was being held under guard. One of the men assigned to watch him had apparently fallen asleep, and in the confusion that followed Martha's revelations, no one had noticed the prisoner working to free himself from his bonds. "He's loose!" Morrison shouted, drawing his weapon as Jed rolled away from the sleeping guard and sprinted toward the horses. But instead of trying to escape, Jed ran directly toward the campfire, his hands still partially bound, but his movements purposeful and determined. "Eliza!" he called as gunshots rang out behind him. "The truth, ask Martha about the truth." A rifle bullet caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing to the ground, just yards from where she sat. Blood immediately began soaking through his shirt, but his eyes remained focused on her face with desperate intensity. "The documents," he gasped as Morrison and the other guards closed in on him. "All lies. Martha knows she has proof. Shut him up," Samuel ordered, his composure finally cracking under the pressure of exposure. "We don't need to listen to the desperate ravings of a kidnapper." but Martha was already moving, reaching into her reticule to withdraw a thick packet of papers. Actually, I think we do need to listen. Because these documents, the real ones, obtained from legitimate sources, tell a very different story about everyone involved in this mess. She handed the packet to Eliza, whose hands trembled as she recognized official seals, authentic letterheads, and the careful handwriting of legitimate record keepers. "Read them," Martha urged. "Read them all, and then decide who's been telling you the truth and who's been using you as a pawn in their financial schemes." As Eliza began to examine the documents, the sound of approaching hoofbeats announced the arrival of more riders. But these weren't part of their original party. They were townspeople from Red Bluff, led by the current sheriff and several members of the town council who had apparently decided to meet the returning expedition rather than wait for it to reach town. "Sheriff Bradley," Martha called out as the new arrivals dismounted. "Perfect timing. I think you're going to find this situation quite a bit more complicated than you were led to believe." The hidden key to the jail cell that Martha had brought wasn't just a piece of metal, it was a symbol of her determination to unlock the truth, regardless of who might be damaged by its revelation. As the real evidence began to emerge and the carefully constructed lies started to crumble, Eliza realized that tomorrow's confrontation in Red Bluff would be about much more than her personal choices. It would be about justice, truth, and the courage required to stand up to powerful men who had been willing to destroy lives to protect their own interests. Jed lay bleeding in the dirt beside the campfire, his grey eyes still fixed on her face with an expression that held no deception, no calculation, only the simple honesty of a man who had tried to protect her from forces much more dangerous than anything he represented. The real villain in this story, she was beginning to understand, had never been the mountain man who had given her the chance to choose her own path. It had been the respectable pillars of society who had been willing to sacrifice her happiness on the altar of their own greed. Tomorrow, in Red Bluff, the truth would finally have its day in court, and she would be ready to testify, not as a victim who needed to be rescued, but as a woman who had finally learned to recognize the difference between those who sought to control her and those who sought to set her free. The key in Martha's hand gleamed in the firelight, promising that some locks could still be opened, some truths could still be told, and some choices could still be defended, no matter how powerful the forces arrayed against them. The makeshift tribunal that convened the next morning in Red Bluff's town hall bore little resemblance to the elegant wedding that had been planned for the same weekend. Instead of flowers and ribbon, the room was filled with grim-faced men, clutching legal documents and nursing grudges. The entire population of Red Bluff seemed to have squeezed into the available space, drawn by the promise of justice and the irresistible allure of watching their social betters face public humiliation. Judge Harrison, who had been summoned from the territorial capital specifically to handle this case, presided over the proceedings with the weary efficiency of a man who had seen too many frontier disputes resolved through violence rather than law. He was a thin, bearded figure whose reputation for fairness was matched only by his impatience with elaborate deceptions and financial manipulation. "This hearing," he announced to the packed room, "will determine the facts surrounding the alleged kidnapping of Miss Eliza Thornton, the evidence of criminal conspiracy, and the question of financial fraud that has apparently corrupted what should have been a simple case of matrimonial disputes." Eliza sat in the front row, flanked by Martha Caldwell and the territorial attorney who had arrived with Judge Harrison. Across the aisle, Samuel Whitmore consulted nervously with his own lawyer, while Charles Thornton maintained the stoic expression of a man determined to weather whatever storm was coming. At the defendant's table, Jed sat with his wounded shoulder in a sling, his face pale but alert. The local doctor had removed the bullet and declared the wound serious but not life-threatening, assessment that had clearly disappointed Samuel, who had been hoping for more dramatic consequences to his order to shoot. "Mr. Morrison," Judge Harrison called. "You may present your evidence against the defendant." Morrison rose with his characteristic confidence, but Eliza noticed something different in his demeanor, a brittleness that suggested a man operating on the edge of his competence. He approached the bench, carrying the same leather portfolio that had been so damning 3 days earlier. "Your Honor, the evidence clearly shows that Jedediah Cole orchestrated an elaborate scheme to kidnap Miss Thornton for financial gain. These documents prove his desperate circumstances, his willingness to use deception, and his complete lack of moral character." But as Morrison began to present his evidence, Martha Caldwell rose from her seat with the measured authority of someone who had been waiting her entire life for this moment. "Your Honor," she interrupted, "before Mr. Morrison proceeds further with his presentation, I believe the court should examine the authenticity of those documents. As a citizen of this territory and the widow of a former peace officer, I have conducted my own investigation into this matter, and I have reason to believe that evidence fraud has been committed." Judge Harrison's eyebrows rose with interest. Frontier justice moved quickly when circumstances demanded it, and he had clearly been briefed on Martha's reputation for thoroughness and honesty. "Mrs. Caldwell, you may proceed." Martha approached the bench, carrying her own portfolio thicker than Morrison's, and bearing the worn edges of documents that had been handled by legitimate institutions. "Your Honor, I present genuine records from territorial offices, bank institutions, and legal authorities that directly contradict every major claim made by the prosecution." She opened her portfolio and withdrew a death certificate, its official seals clearly visible even from the back of the courtroom. "This document proves that Maria Santos, the woman allegedly married to Mr. Cole, died of cholera in Colorado Territory 2 years before the supposed marriage took place. The marriage certificate presented by Mr. Morrison is therefore a fabrication." A murmur of shock rippled through the courtroom. Morrison's face had gone ashen, but he attempted to maintain his professional composure. "Your Honor, there must be some mistake." "There is indeed a mistake," Martha continued, withdrawing more documents. "But it wasn't made by territorial record keepers. These financial statements from banks in Helena, Butte, and Billings show that Mr. Cole not only has no outstanding debts with these institutions, but maintains substantial deposits and owns his ranch property free and clear." The revelation hit the courtroom like a physical force. Spectators began whispering among themselves, and several members of the town council exchanged meaningful glances. "Furthermore," Martha continued, now clearly enjoying herself, "I have here a confession written in Mr. Samuel Whitmore's own hand, obtained from his personal papers through entirely legal means." She held up a document that made Samuel leap to his feet in protest. "That's private correspondence. You had no right." "I had every right when it was discovered in papers being prepared for bankruptcy proceedings," Martha replied calmly. "Mr. Whitmore, it seems, wrote a rather detailed letter to a business associate in California, explaining his plan to marry Miss Thornton specifically to gain access to her inheritance and save his failing ranch operation." Judge Harrison extended his hand for the document, and the silence in the courtroom became absolute as he read its contents. When he looked up, his expression had shifted from judicial neutrality to something much harder. "Mr. Whitmore," he said quietly, "this letter, if authentic, suggests that your engagement to Miss Thornton was contracted under false pretenses, with the specific intent to defraud her family of substantial assets." Samuel's lawyer whispered urgently in his client's ear, but Samuel himself seemed to have lost the capacity for rational response. His face was flushed with anger and humiliation, and when he spoke, his voice carried the desperation of a man watching his life's work crumble in public. "This is all irrelevant," he shouted. "Eliza was kidnapped from our wedding. Cole is a criminal who used violence and deception to steal my bride. Whatever my private business arrangements might be, they don't change the fact that a crime was committed." But Judge Harrison was no longer listening to Samuel's protests. Instead, He had turned his attention to Eliza herself, studying her with the careful assessment of a man accustomed to evaluating truth from multiple angles. "Miss Thornton," he said gently, "you have heard these revelations about the evidence against Mr. Cole and the motivations behind your engagement to Mr. Whitmore. In light of this information, I would like you to tell this court, in your own words and under oath, exactly what happened on the day of your wedding." Eliza rose slowly, feeling the weight of every eye in the courtroom upon her. This was the moment she had been preparing for since Martha's revelations the night before the chance to speak her truth publicly, regardless of the consequences for her reputation or her family's standing in the community. "Your Honor," she began, her voice clear and steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to reveal. "I was not kidnapped from my wedding. I chose to leave with Jedediah Cole because I realized that I was about to make the greatest mistake of my life." The admission sent a wave of shocked murmurs through the courtroom, but she continued without pause. "I had been engaged to Mr. Whitmore for 8 months, during which time I felt increasingly trapped by circumstances I couldn't control and choices I hadn't made. When Jed appeared at the church, he offered me something I had never had before: the opportunity to choose my own path, regardless of what others expected of me." "But surely," Judge Harrison prompted, "you understood the social and legal implications of abandoning your wedding." "I understood them perfectly, but I also understood that I was being used as a bargaining chip in financial arrangements that had nothing to do with my happiness or well-being. The revelations about Mr. Whitmore's debts and my father's involvement in covering them only confirm what I suspected, that my marriage was never about love or compatibility, but about money and business connections." Charles Thornton started to rise from his seat, his face dark with anger, but Judge Harrison gestured for him to remain seated. "Miss Thornton, do you wish to press charges against Mr. Cole for kidnapping or any other crime?" The question hung in the air like incense in a cathedral, heavy with implication and possibility. This was her chance to end the matter cleanly, to return to the safety and security of her previous life, with her reputation intact and her future assured. Instead, she looked directly at Jed, seeing in his grey eyes the same honesty that had first attracted her 7 years earlier. Whatever mistakes he might have made, whatever poor choices had brought him to this moment, he had given her the greatest gift anyone could offer: the chance to discover who she really was when freed from the expectations of others. "No, Your Honor," she said clearly. "I do not wish to press charges against Mr. Cole. He committed no crime against me. If anything, he saved me from a crime that was being committed by others: the theft of my agency, my choices, and my right to determine my own future." The confession that Samuel had written in his own hand, the document that Martha had discovered among his bankruptcy papers, was more than just evidence of financial fraud. It was proof of the calculated nature of his pursuit of her, the cold-blooded planning that had gone into their courtship, and the complete absence of genuine affection in their relationship. As Judge Harrison examined the document more closely, reading aloud passages that described her inheritance in terms of assets to be acquired rather than a person to be loved, Eliza felt a sense of vindication that went beyond personal satisfaction. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about establishing the principle that women had the right to make their own choices, even when those choices disrupted carefully laid plans and threatened powerful interests. The confession in Samuel's handwriting would seal his fate and expose the conspiracy that had nearly trapped her in a loveless marriage. But more than that, it would establish a precedent that might protect other women from similar manipulation in the future. For the first time since leaving Red Bluff, she felt truly hopeful about what lay ahead. The final confrontation came not from Judge Harrison's bench, but from Charles Thornton himself, who could no longer contain the fury and desperation that had been building since Martha's first revelation. As the judge continued reading Samuel's confession aloud, detailing the calculated nature of the engagement and the specific dollar amounts involved in the fraud, Charles rose from his seat with the bearing of a man who had nothing left to lose. "Enough!" he roared, his voice carrying the authority that had built a banking empire from nothing. "This entire proceeding is a travesty. My daughter has been manipulated, deceived, and traumatized by a criminal who has somehow convinced her that his crimes were acts of love." Judge Harrison looked up from the confession with the patient expression of a man accustomed to emotional outbursts in his courtroom. "Mr. Thornton, you will have your opportunity to speak when—" "I'll speak now," Charles interrupted, his face flushed with the kind of rage that comes from watching carefully laid plans crumble in public. "For 30 years, I've built something worthwhile in this God-forsaken territory. I've brought civilization to a place that was nothing but wilderness and savages. I've created opportunities for decent people to build decent lives, and I've done it all for her." He pointed at Eliza with a trembling finger, his voice breaking slightly as 3 decades of suppressed emotion came pouring out. "Everything I've done, every sacrifice I've made, every enemy I've acquired in the name of progress and prosperity, all of it was to ensure that my daughter would never know the poverty and uncertainty that defined my own childhood. And now she wants to throw it all away for what? For some romantic fantasy about living in the wilderness with a man who can't provide for her properly." The courtroom had fallen completely silent, mesmerized by the spectacle of one of Red Bluff's most powerful men destroying himself in public. But Eliza felt something unexpected rising in her chest, not anger or embarrassment, but a profound sadness for the man who had loved her so much that he had forgotten to consider whether his love was what she actually needed. "Father," she said gently, rising from her seat despite Judge Harrison's gesture for her to remain seated, "I know you sacrificed for me. I know you worked impossible hours and made difficult choices to give me opportunities you never had. But you never asked me what I wanted those opportunities to become." "You're 28 years old," he replied, his voice now carrying more pain than anger. "You think you know what you want, but you don't understand what the world does to women who make foolish choices. You don't understand how quickly beauty fades and how harshly society judges those who step outside acceptable boundaries." "Maybe not. But I understand something else. I understand what happens to women who spend their entire lives doing what others think is best for them. They disappear, Father. They become so focused on meeting everyone else's expectations that they forget who they are underneath all those obligations." Charles Thornton stared at his daughter as if seeing her clearly for the first time, and what he saw seemed to drain the fight out of him completely. His shoulders sagged, his face aged a decade in the space of a few seconds, and when he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I just wanted you to be safe. I know, but safe isn't the same as happy, and security isn't the same as freedom." Judge Harrison cleared his throat, gently redirecting attention back to the legal matters at hand. "Mr. Thornton, these are important family discussions, but this court needs to address the criminal charges that have been brought. Mr. Morrison, do you wish to proceed with your case against Mr. Cole, given the evidence that has been presented?" Morrison stood slowly, his face a mask of professional composure that couldn't quite hide the defeat in his eyes. The tracker, who had built his reputation on never losing his quarry, was facing the first failure of his career, and it was happening in the most public way possible. "Your Honor," he said carefully, "in light of the new evidence presented by Mrs. Caldwell, I believe the prosecution's case requires significant revision. The documents I relied upon appear to have been—" He paused, searching for words that wouldn't admit to his own culpability. "Misrepresented to me by parties who had their own interests in seeing Mr. Cole discredited." It was as close to an admission of prosecutorial fraud as the courtroom was likely to hear, but Judge Harrison seemed satisfied with the acknowledgement. "In that case, I hereby dismiss all charges against Jedediah Cole. The evidence suggests that what occurred was not a kidnapping, but a consensual elopement, complicated by family opposition and financial interests that were not disclosed to the principals involved." But the judge wasn't finished. He turned his attention to Samuel Whitmore, whose face had gone pale as the implications of the confession became clear. "Mr. Whitmore," the document presented by Mrs. Caldwell suggests that you entered into an engagement contract under false pretenses, with the specific intent to defraud the Thornton family of substantial assets. These are serious criminal charges that will require separate proceedings. Samuel's lawyer whispered urgently in his ear, but Samuel himself seemed to have lost the capacity for rational response. Instead, he rose from his chair with jerky, uncontrolled movements and reached into his jacket pocket. "None of this matters," he said, his voice carrying the unstable edge of a man whose entire world was collapsing. "She's my bride. The papers were signed, the ceremony was planned, the contracts were executed. She belongs to me, and I won't let some mountain savage steal what's rightfully mine." The derringer he pulled from his pocket was small but deadly at close range, its nickel-plated surface gleaming in the courtroom's lamplight. Several people screamed, and men began diving for cover, but Samuel's attention was focused entirely on Jed, who remained seated despite the obvious threat. "You took everything from me," Samuel continued, his hand shaking as he pointed the weapon. "My bride, my future, my chance to save everything I've worked for. But you won't live to enjoy your victory." "Samuel, no!" Eliza started to move toward him, but Martha Caldwell's strong hand on her arm held her back. "Don't be foolish, child," Martha whispered urgently. "A desperate man with a gun is liable to shoot anyone who gets in his way." But Jed was rising slowly from his chair, his wounded shoulder clearly causing him pain, but his movements deliberate and calm. "Whitmore," he said quietly, "this isn't going to solve your problems. Shooting me won't bring back your money or your reputation. It'll just add murder to the charges you're already facing. At least I'll have the satisfaction of knowing you didn't win." The confrontation that followed happened with the kind of compressed time that makes witnesses disagree about the sequence of events. Samuel's finger tightened on the trigger just as Sheriff Bradley, who had been moving carefully around the edge of the courtroom, launched himself forward in a desperate tackle. The derringer discharged with a sharp crack that seemed impossibly loud in the enclosed space, but the bullet went wide, shattering a window instead of finding its intended target. Samuel and the sheriff crashed to the floor in a tangle of limbs, and the little weapon went skittering across the wooden planks to come to rest near Judge Harrison's bench. As the sheriff subdued Samuel with the help of several other men, Eliza found herself thinking about the simple gold band that Jed had shown her during their brief time together in the wilderness. It was a plain circle of metal, unremarkable in every way except for what it represented. A promise made freely between equals, without coercion or financial incentive, based on nothing more complicated than mutual love and respect. It was so different from the elaborate engagement ring that Samuel had presented to her with such ceremony, the expensive diamond that had been chosen not for its beauty but for its value, the ostentatious symbol of wealth that had been designed to impress others rather than express genuine feeling. "Miss Thornton," Judge Harrison said as order was restored to his courtroom, "you are free to make whatever choices you deem appropriate regarding your future. The law recognizes your right to determine your own fate, regardless of previous arrangements or family expectations." She looked around the courtroom, taking in the faces of people who had known her since childhood, who had watched her grow from a precocious little girl into the woman she had become. Some looked disapproving, others sympathetic, but most simply looked curious about what she would do next. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said clearly. "I intend to exercise that right." The new wedding ring that she envisioned, simple, honest, chosen freely rather than imposed by circumstances, would represent everything that the elaborate engagement ring had failed to provide. Not ownership or obligation, but partnership. Not security purchased with submission, but freedom earned through courage. As Samuel was led away in chains and the courtroom began to empty, Eliza found herself face to face with her father, whose expression held a mixture of love, disappointment, and something that might have been the beginning of understanding. "I suppose this means you won't be coming home," he said quietly. "I'll always be your daughter, father, but yes, I think it's time I made a home of my own choosing." The simple gold band in her imagination seemed to grow warmer as she spoke, promising a future built on truth rather than convenience, love rather than obligation, and the hard-won knowledge that some choices are worth defending no matter what they cost. 6 months later, as autumn painted the Montana mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Eliza stood in the doorway of the cabin that she and Jed had built together with their own hands. The structure was modest by Red Bluff standards, 2 rooms, a stone fireplace, and windows that framed views of wilderness rather than manicured gardens. But it felt more like home than any of the grand houses she had known in her previous life. The cabin represented everything that had been missing from her father's careful plans for her future. Every log had been chosen and placed with intention, every nail driven with purpose, every decision made jointly by 2 people who understood that building a life together meant more than simply combining their resources. It was honest work that produced honest shelter, created through partnership rather than purchased with inherited wealth. "Are you ready?" Jed asked, adjusting the collar of his best shirt, not finest, for he owned nothing that could be called fine by Red Bluff standards, but clean and mended and worn with the dignity of a man who had learned to value substance over appearance. Eliza smoothed the skirt of her dress, a simple blue cotton that she had sewn herself, using skills learned from necessity rather than taught by finishing school instructors. It fit her properly because she had made it to fit her life, not to impress observers or conform to fashion dictates established by women whose biggest challenge was choosing between multiple forms of entertainment. "More ready than I've ever been for anything," she replied, and meant it completely. The wedding ceremony that awaited them bore no resemblance to the elaborate affair that had been planned for her marriage to Samuel Whitmore. Instead of a church full of social obligations, they had invited only those people whose presence would add genuine joy to the occasion. Martha Caldwell, who had become both friend and surrogate mother, Sheriff Bradley, whose intervention had prevented tragedy in the courtroom, and Running Bear with several members of his band, who had traveled from their winter camp to witness the formal conclusion of what they considered a spiritual journey that had begun long before the legal complications arose. Charles Thornton had been invited but had declined to attend, his letter of response brief and formal, but not unkind. He was, he explained, still learning to accept his daughter's choices, and he needed more time before he could celebrate them. But he had included a bank draft for a substantial sum, not as a dowry or an attempt to control their future, but as an acknowledgement that his love for her transcended his disappointment in her decisions. The ceremony itself took place in the meadow, where Jed had proposed properly 6 weeks earlier, not with grand gestures or elaborate speeches, but with the simple question of whether she wanted to build something permanent together. The setting was the same grove where they had first camped during their flight from Red Bluff, where she had begun to understand the difference between security and freedom, between safety and authenticity. Reverend Mackenzie, who had been shocked by the disruption of her first wedding but had grown to understand the circumstances that had caused it, performed the service with gentle humor and genuine warmth. His words focused not on duty and obligation, but on choice and commitment, the daily decision to choose each other repeatedly, even when circumstances made other options available. "Marriage," he said as they stood beneath the golden aspens, "is not a contract that binds people against their will, but a promise that 2 free individuals make to journey through life as partners. It succeeds not because external forces compel it, but because both parties continue to find value in the commitment they have chosen to make." The ring that Jed placed on her finger was indeed the simple gold band she had envisioned during the courtroom confrontation, unadorned, unpretentious but warm with the promise it represented. It had been crafted by a metalsmith in Helena using gold that Jed had panned himself from a creek near their cabin, and its surface bore the slight irregularities that marked it as the work of human hands rather than industrial machinery. When it came time for her vows, Eliza found herself thinking not about the words she had rehearsed, but about the journey that had brought them to this moment. 6 months earlier, she had been a woman defined entirely by other people's expectations, living a life that felt like an elaborate performance designed to please an audience she had never chosen. Now she was someone who had learned that authenticity required courage, that happiness demanded the willingness to disappoint those who preferred her compliance to her joy. "I promise," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the meadow, "to choose you every day, not because society or family or financial necessity demands it, but because you have shown me who I am when I'm free to be myself. I promise to build a life with you that honors both our individual dreams and our shared hopes, and to remember that the best marriages are not those that provide the most security, but those that create the most room for growth." The reception that followed was as unconventional as the ceremony itself. Instead of a formal dinner with multiple courses and elaborate toasts, they shared a simple meal prepared collectively by their guests, with everyone contributing something to the feast. Running Bear had brought venison from a recent hunt. Martha had baked bread using flour ground from wheat grown on her own small farm, and Sheriff Bradley had surprised everyone by producing a bottle of French champagne that had been waiting years for an occasion worthy of its consumption. As the sun set behind the western peaks and the conversation shifted from celebration to reflection, Eliza found herself in quiet conversation with Martha, who had become not just a friend, but a mentor in the art of living according to one's own values rather than society's expectations. "Any regrets?" Martha asked, echoing the question that had been posed so many times during their journey from Red Bluff to this meadow. "Only one," Eliza replied thoughtfully. "I regret that it took me so long to understand the difference between what I was supposed to want and what I actually wanted. I wasted too many years trying to be the person others needed me to be, instead of discovering who I was meant to become. That's not wasted time, child. That's education. You can't appreciate freedom until you've experienced constraint, can't value authenticity until you've lived with pretense. Everything that happened before brought you to this moment, even the mistakes and the pain and the confusion." As if to underscore Martha's point, a letter arrived the next morning via territorial post, bearing the return address of Red Bluff, but written in an unfamiliar hand. It proved to be from Sarah Patterson, the woman they had encountered during their flight, whose sharp eyes had ultimately contributed to their capture, but whose testimony had also helped expose the conspiracy against them. "Mrs. Cole," the letter began, using Eliza's new name with obvious pleasure, "I hope this finds you well and happy in your new life. I wanted you to know that your courage in standing up for your right to choose has inspired other women in our community to examine their own situations more carefully." The letter went on to describe several marriages that had been reconsidered, several engagements that had been broken off when the true motivations behind them became clear, and a general awakening among the territory's women to the possibility that they possessed more agency than they had previously understood. "Your story has become something of a legend," Sarah wrote, "told around kitchen tables and at quilting circles as an example of what becomes possible when someone finds the courage to say no to what others expect and yes to what their own heart knows to be true." But perhaps the most significant news in the letter concerned Samuel Whitmore himself, who had been sentenced to 5 years in territorial prison for fraud and attempted murder. His ranch had been sold to satisfy his creditors, and his political connections had evaporated once the extent of his deception became public knowledge. "Justice has been served," Sarah concluded, "but more importantly, truth has been established." No one in this territory will forget the lesson you taught us, that a woman's consent cannot be assumed, that her choices must be respected, and that love is too precious to be sacrificed on the altar of financial convenience. Reading the letter in the quiet of their cabin, with the morning sun streaming through windows that framed views of mountains and meadows, Eliza felt a deep sense of completion. Their story had become larger than their individual choices, had rippled outward to affect other lives in ways they had never intended or imagined. That afternoon, as they worked together to prepare their garden for winter, pulling the last vegetables, composting the spent plants, planning next year's improvements, she found herself thinking about the long journey from the pressed wildflower in her jewelry box to the simple gold band on her finger. The flower had represented dreams deferred, hopes hidden away for safekeeping until circumstances might permit their fulfillment. The ring represented dreams realized, hopes transformed into daily reality through the simple but revolutionary act of choosing authenticity over expectation. "What are you thinking about?" Jed asked, noticing her contemplative mood as they stacked firewood for the approaching winter. "About how sometimes the best days of our lives are the ones we never could have planned," she replied. 6 months ago, if someone had told me I'd be living in a cabin I helped build, married to a man who was supposed to be my kidnapper, I would have thought they were describing someone else's life entirely. And now? Now I understand that this was always my life. I just had to find the courage to claim it. As evening approached and they prepared their simple dinner, Eliza reflected on how profoundly her definition of wealth had changed. In Red Bluff, wealth had meant accumulation of money, property, social connections, influence. Here, wealth meant sufficiency: enough food, enough warmth, enough meaningful work, enough love to sustain two people who had chosen to build something together. The hand-built cabin that surrounded them represented the ultimate expression of this new understanding. Every board, every stone, every careful joint spoke of partnership rather than ownership, of creation rather than acquisition. It was shelter earned through their own labor, designed to meet their actual needs rather than to impress observers or demonstrate status. "Do you miss any of it?" Jed asked as they sat before their fireplace, sharing the companionable silence that had become one of their greatest luxuries. The comfort, the security, the certainty of knowing exactly what each day would bring. Eliza considered the question seriously, examining her feelings for any trace of nostalgia or regret. "I miss the illusion of safety," she said finally, "but I don't miss the reality of feeling trapped. I miss my father's approval, but I don't miss the constant pressure to earn it by sacrificing my own judgment. I miss the comfort of knowing exactly what was expected of me, but I don't miss the suffocation of never being able to exceed those expectations." "And the future? Any fears about what we're building here?" "Of course. We could fail at farming, or face a winter we're not prepared for, or discover that we're not as compatible as we thought when we're tested by real hardship. But those are honest fears about real challenges, not the kind of existential dread that comes from living someone else's life." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of hoofbeats approaching their cabin, unusual enough in their remote location to bring them both to their feet in alert attention. But the rider who emerged from the gathering dusk was Charles Thornton, alone and travel-worn, leading a pack horse loaded with supplies. "Father!" Eliza stepped outside to greet him, her heart racing with a mixture of joy and apprehension. "What are you doing here?" Charles dismounted slowly, his movements betraying the fatigue of someone who had been riding hard for several days. When he looked at his daughter, his expression held a complexity of emotion that defied easy interpretation. Love, certainly, but also something that might have been pride mixed with residual disappointment. "I came to see how you were managing," he said simply, "and to bring some things I thought you might need for winter." The supplies he had brought were practical rather than luxurious quality tools, warm blankets, preserved foods that would supplement their own preparations for the cold months ahead. But more than the material gifts, his presence represented something far more valuable: acceptance, if not complete understanding, of the choices she had made. They spent the evening sharing stories, Charles, describing the changes in Red Bluff since the scandal of the disrupted wedding, Eliza and Jed explaining the rhythms of their new life and their plans for expanding their small farm in the coming years. The conversation was sometimes awkward, sometimes emotional, but always honest in a way that their previous relationship had never permitted. "I still think you could have chosen an easier path," Charles admitted as they prepared to retire for the night. "But I'm beginning to understand that easier isn't always better, and that security purchased at the cost of happiness is no bargain at all." He stayed for 3 days, long enough to help them complete their winter preparations and to observe firsthand the contentment that radiated from his daughter like warmth from their hearth. When he finally prepared to leave, his farewell carried the promise of future visits and the acknowledgement that family bonds could survive even fundamental disagreements about life's proper course. "Take care of her," he said to Jed, but without the threatening undertone that such words usually carried. "And let her take care of you. I think I'm finally beginning to understand that the strongest marriages are partnerships, not protectorates." As they watched him ride away toward Red Bluff and the world they had left behind, Eliza felt the final pieces of her transformation settling into place. She was no longer the dutiful daughter or the rebellious escapee, but simply a woman who had found her way to a life that fit her actual nature rather than society's expectations. The hand-built cabin stood around them like a promise fulfilled, its walls enclosing not just physical space, but the possibility of authentic happiness earned through honest choices. Outside, the Montana wilderness stretched endlessly in all directions, vast enough to contain whatever dreams they might dare to pursue. As winter's first snow began to fall, dusting the meadow where they had been married and the peaks that surrounded their chosen home, Eliza understood that sometimes the best days of our lives are not the ones that proceed according to plan, but the ones that teach us who we truly are when we have the courage to choose ourselves.